Hi, I'm Ben.
I'm Isabelle.
Welcome to Conversations in Company, a podcast from the charity Suicide&Co, here to make the suicide loss journey a little less lonely.
We've both been on the journey for a few years.
I lost my brother to suicide in 2018.
And I lost my cousin to suicide in 2017.
We really hope that we and our guests can offer you some companionship wherever you are on this journey. Hi Isabelle.
Hello. How are you?
How are you? How's Edinburgh Fringe going?
It's going okay. Yeah.
Good.
Got a suitably husky voice.
Yeah.
Despite being 4 months pregnant, I still went out last night.
Amazing. Yes. I've never actually been to Edinburgh. I'd love to go. I
Being
need to get
pregnant.
myself
No,
to
I know.
Edinburgh Fringe. I've never been pregnant myself. But yeah, looking forward to our chat today. Because we're talking today about creativity and channeling grief through creativity, and something I know that you've done in the past with your previous
Yeah.
show. So something I'd really love to sort of chat through with you. Um, I don't I don't really like think of myself as being very creative, but I guess actually when I look through my own story, my own grief, there are moments where actually I was creative and did find like a bit of a creative outlet. And a lot of people find it useful, right?
Yeah.
Just using their grief and it sort of expressing their grief through creativity.
Yeah. It's a big theme often. I mean, this year as well as with any year, but often at the Edinburgh Fringe, you'll find that there are people who've created shows from trauma. And I think it's really interesting because I actually love them. And I know there's kind of this very comedy purists are like, oh, it's called the Edinburgh Whinge. It's not jokes anymore. It's just someone. And I'm like, yeah, okay. But like, I think for me, and I kind of said this a little bit in my show, is like there's space for like the ups and downs of it. And I think it's also for an audience, it's a really nice way to navigate sometimes, and particularly for a British audience who are sometimes a little bit emotionally repressed, like being able to like empathize with someone else's pain, they're able to like find their way through their own pain.
Yeah. And from
Not
your
that I'm
perspective as well.
therapizing the entirety of Britain, but
But in your shows you are, yeah.
yeah.
Anyone that's bought a ticket to Isabel's shows, yeah. And in
Or
your experience as well, like creating comedy out of a bad situation as well, and like creating sort of
yeah.
um laughing at it. That's quite a nice way of like of almost sort of owning a situation, or like being able to sort of objectively see something and sort of project some sort of laughter or happiness back onto it.
I think um, we can kind of get into it. My show was it was a comedy. It was about grief, and it kind of what I did was dissected like how people. So it was almost like a kind of in some ways kind of a documentary about like how people grieve and like how we manage conversations, and it's kind of a bit what we've done in this podcast as well. And I did it in a funny way. And actually, I found the only way of really being able to keep it light was I I reference the death and I say someone's died, and no one knows who it was or how it happened until the final 2 minutes of a 52-minute show. So like I was aware that like for me that show was about partly about like how we hide it and how we manage it, and so it was about it was me constantly talking about that, making jokes about it, but also I did it in essence throughout the whole show because no one knew who died until I kind of gave it a bit of an epilogue at the end.
Yeah, it was an amazing show. Did it help you going through that process?
Um, well, so some of it I took from notes that I wrote in the year after Jen died, and then I think it was about bringing. I remember someone on a podcast years ago, someone said, I was trying to write a stand up show. I was trying to write my first hour of like jokes. And someone was like, you have to write the thing that's currently like the most present in your head. You have to write about that because it's blocking everything else. And I remember being like, oh God, I'm gonna have to write one of those trauma shows. Oh fuck. Um, uh, Arguably ended up being my greatest work. So, pleased I did. But um, to, I found it helped me in some ways process a bit more deeply. Like I think I
Mm,
had done a lot of processing and I'd had a lot of therapy, but it took me, and I started writing it mid 2018, and then I probably had a finished draft early 2019, and then then it was just about honing and tweaking like tenses and stuff, like very writer business shit. But and then I remember when I was rehearsing it being like, oh God, I hadn't realized how tough that was. So like in
mm,
rehearsal, I remember that initially, and then after a while, you start it becomes just a process that you go through in the hour of the show, and you kind of live the ups and downs. And I was talking to Cariad actually when I did her podcast about like there were days when I had to just be like, right, you can't go too deep today, because as a performer you can really dig out from like the pits of your like emotional stomach and really give the audience everything, and you'll make them all cry. But I had to, on days when I was feeling a bit more low, I had to remember that I then had to be able to pick myself up
mm,
before I went to bed,
mm.
basically. So I did grow, and it did help me process, but I also had to learn quite a lot about my own, how I react to things, and like how I was in a way still processing it and also reprocessing every day.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, that sometimes it needs grief needs like a vehicle to be processed, and I think
Yeah,
creativity can sometimes be that vehicle, but also then it can sort of create it quite an upfront meeting with grief as well. It can be quite a difficult thing. I mean, I guess the
yeah.
only sort of experience I've got in terms of channeling creativity into this is I don't do art. Absolutely shocking painter. I've tried. My dad is an incredible drawer. He could draw like these incredible cartoons. Sam, my brother, incredible at painting, music, all of these things. I just missed all of the creative arty genes. I was terrible. I remember me and my friend were in school and we had to do art. I say had to do art. Some people loved art. I couldn't really get my head around it. And we were on
Yeah.
some, the teacher used to be so kind to me and Johnny. She'd be like, "Oh, that's so good, boys. That's really good. Good job with that." And then we had like an A level art student next to us, and then she'd go to her work and be like, "That's terrible. You need to change this, change this." And me and Johnny were like, "We're clearly like so bad at this that we're getting the sympathy sympathy vote." But I guess I channeled some sort of creativity through my work and obviously through writing a book, and you can sort of
Yeah,
just be able to you can sort of it's really difficult to explain, isn't it? But sometimes grief can be so like out of reach, and those emotions can be so hard to access, particularly as Brits. And suddenly, if you create like a
mm,
different forum or like a vehicle for it, then it can be slightly easier to access. And it's
yeah,
something that really interests me because I think it's this really interesting element to emotions that it doesn't necessarily have to be said or felt. It can actually be expressed in different ways, and might be something that can be helpful for people listening. Um,
mm,
we're being joined in the wings by Nigel Linacre, who created the Grief Opera. Um, Opera again, I can add that to the list of painting and drawing that I can't do. I used to be able to sing at school, and then and never again. So I have a huge amount of respect for the talent that goes into it, but actually the reason that Nigel started the Grief Opera is equally inspiring. And Nigel joins us now. Really, really good to see you, Nigel. Thanks so much for making the time to chat to us and come on here. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay, thank you, Ben. It's great to be here with you both.
Good, thank you. Do you mind just starting us off by explaining as much as you're comfortable, your relationship with suicide, and introduce us to the grief opera. How did that start? What was the thought process behind that?
Gosh, sure, Ben. So, I lost my son, George Linacre, in 2021. I didn't see it coming. He died by suicide, and he was a musician. And he was a musician who, through lockdown, couldn't play, couldn't perform, all of that. And so when we got the phone call from the police, first of all, one's propelled into shock, kind of numb, like being on a film set. Just this, and I think you wrote about that in your book, Ben. It just like, this is a wrong script. There's a big mistake being made. I can't process it. I'm just calling out to George. But you still have to get involved with things like the funeral and all that difficult stuff. And my son and daughter, surviving son and daughter, said they would do the eulogy at the funeral. And I thought, what am I going to do at the funeral? And I was writing about George and my relationship, and I thought I would write a poem. I write poems about George for the funeral. And so stuff was coming up about George and my relationship with him and grief. And I let it flow. I didn't know what else to do each day, morning. I stopped work and all that. So what am I going to do? And I started imagining that it would be a grief memoir, a written book. I write books, so I can imagine books. But then one day, the words, the grief opera, just went into my mind, just kind of like, bang, the grief opera. I'm just like minding my own business. And I called Vladimir Miller, who's a great jazz band leader and composer who I've done some work with. And he and I set about creating it, my words and his music. And that was the genesis of the grief. And Vladimir used some of my son George's rhythms. George is a bass guitarist with a band called S-Char, performed in Britain and Germany and so forth. And so when Vlad said that he'd put George's music in, I thought, beautiful. This is something. This really, George's music goes on. And so we had a fair amount of work to do to move some of the narrative to, narrative is not the same as language for performance. I want, so I had to think about how it would work dramatically. And we created it, and we performed it live 4 times. And the first time we performed it, there are like 28 tracks in the grief opera, some beautiful music. Vladimir created a lot of beautiful music, and we performed, and we didn't know how the audience would respond. And basically the jaws dropped. I mean, it's like, and there was silence at the end of each part of it, just silence, including at halftime. Like, I kind of went round some people at halftime, like, what are you seeing? And then at the end, there's just 100% standing ovation. I mean, just an outpouring of emotion, right, from everybody. And my son Tom, who brings George's voice into play, came up, and we just had the biggest hug, and this is the beginning of the grief opera.
Wow. It's such an amazing thing to have done, particularly with George's music as well, being able to keep that alive and then use that in something that's also through, I guess, sort of centered to this as well, by using and channeling grief and these things through creativity. Actually, we allow audiences and other people to connect with something in that as well, and through that help other people experience those feelings for themselves and process things. That is stunning. And I've heard some of the opera, and it is beautiful music. It is absolutely amazing. So well done. Congratulations, Nigel, on what you've done and what you've achieved. That's a huge feat to do, considering what you've been through. I guess my question around this then is, how did how did that process help you? Because I think like creativity can be an outlet in itself to express emotion, singing, painting, dancing, whatever that is. But I think in the process of like writing, like in Isabel's case, writing her stand up, or writing an opera, or for me writing like some words on a page for a book. Like there's an element of it. It's the only time that you get really to actually sit with your thoughts and really analyze like a situation and sort of um, and for me at least, like it was one of the only chances I got to really like interrogate what I was actually thinking, what was actually going on. How did that process help you?
It's a great question, Ben. I think to start with, I didn't want anything. You know, when we're in, as we know, a state of extreme grief, what 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 do you want? Nothing. I mean, I didn't even want. I didn't actually want to live. I didn't want to die. I didn't want anything. I'm just like, as you say, sitting with your thoughts, sitting and scrawling, writing, typing, whatever is a way, can be a really helpful way to start to process something. So, so I think after a while, I realized that I needed something meaningful to come from George's death. I realized that was a need. It couldn't finish with what I still regard as just a great mistake. That couldn't be like, oh, there's a great mistake. My son died. Oh, well, it couldn't finish like that. That would just be too awful. So I needed something. And the grief opera is something. Then as it took shape, well, as you were talking about earlier, you said, Ben, grief needs a vehicle. And Isabelle, you were talking about how people can empathize if they hear someone else's journey or something,
Yeah.
or some part of it. They can explore their own. And it became clear that's what some people were doing in the grief opera. They were kind of like looking at this, hearing this dad and others sing about this extraordinary loss, and reflecting in a slightly indirect way, because they're looking at something else rather than like head on way. So maybe a bit easier, still hard. So a kind of vehicle. So that became a kind of good thing, like, gosh, this could actually be helpful as well. And if we could turn, as you both have in different ways, if I could also, in my case, turn something awful into something helpful. It's still awful, right? It's still awful. But if it's awful and here's something, then that's not nothing.
Mm. I think from my perspective, I think also, and I've sensed it a little bit because I don't do, I mean, unless if someone wants to pay me a lot of money to do the show, I will do it for you. I will bring it out of retirement. But even in finishing writing the show, it was like there was a sense for me, and that, bear in mind, this was like 2 years later, a sense of achievement and a sense of like not putting an end to the grief, but like there was like a sense that I'd kind of got started a new phase in a way. So in the writing of it, I was kind of almost bookending, I think, the end of how I felt. And then in finishing writing that, it was like, okay, well now I sort of know how I feel about it. I know how I feel about it, and I've got it written on a page, and then I perform it, whatever. But I think that so even if you weren't going to perform something, and if you were just like, oh, I just would like to write all of this down, just as a kind of point for anyone who was like, oh, I'm not creative, even if you just go, do you know what, I'm going to write something every day for a month or a year, or whatever, and doing that and finishing it, and I feel like that sense of achievement kind of gave me a bit of a like way forward.
Fantastic.
Does that make sense?
It certainly does to me, Isabelle. And I think what you're suggesting there, I think could be helpful for so many people. I mean, maybe it's just too hard at some points to write anything about anything, right? Maybe it's just too hard. But if you can reflect and think, and I don't know, how do you begin? This is awful, this is terrible, I don't know what to do, blah blah. But wherever you start, once you get words out on a page, you've got something you can see and look at and look back at and reflect on. And maybe after a while, I couldn't write the grief opera now. I couldn't do it now because I'm not in the place that I was in. It would be too soft. I would be kind of going back in memory and thinking, how did I really feel then? But I've got that. That's how I felt. And not immediately at the time that I wrote it or even performed it with Vladimir and others, but in the past 6 months, I've experienced quite a shift. I can't say, Isabelle, for me, it's exactly bookending yet, but a shift. And I think it wouldn't have come about without really sort of interrogating my own grief through the vehicle of the grief opera.
Yeah. I think, Nigel was just, we talked quite a lot about how long it's been. I think it sounds like you're sort of max 4 years in as well, which I think
just under 3 actually, so it's still early. Okay, right?
Yeah, that's very early.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I'm going to say I could probably do a more considered, reflective piece about grief journeys in a few years' time. Yeah. But what I could do at the time, and my father's widow urged me to do it when I was just, she said, right now, write what you're feeling now, just go for that. Yeah. So it's extraordinary. I think it is, people have said it's extraordinary, and I think it's mostly because it isn't like reflective, distanced with perspective. It's like you're right in this nightmare in the grief opera and then sort of finding a way out of it.
It's amazing actually that you've managed to find something that has meant so much to you. And I know that I speak to a lot of people that have gone through suicide loss and other challenges in life, and I think a really common thread with going through loss and trauma and all these things is that people really struggle to find purpose and really want to find some sort of purpose or some sort of like positivity to come from it. And it can be quite difficult to understand what that might be. And I guess creativity can be such an amazing tool for finding that purpose, like you mentioned, Nigel, like bringing George back into the music, giving him his music like longevity. It's part of this now. Sort of being able to create something that wasn't the end, it wasn't nothing. This has happened. Something's happened that's good because of something. Can be a really powerful thing to give yourself. I know that's how I felt with Sam. Like it just felt like a massive waste. And so to be able to do something that was good, suddenly it didn't make it better, but it made it less bad. And that was something. And there's loads and loads of different ways that someone can use creativity and do something that brings purpose, right? A lot of people do charity fundraisers, can feel really beneficial. You're raising money, you're creating a good cause because of this bad thing that happened, and it does naturally make you feel like that bad thing is a slightly less bad, because of the positivity that you've created out of it, and it can give you a sort of purpose, particularly like you mentioned, Nigel, if you're not working or taking time out of work, which can in itself be quite an isolating and lonely place. And so having something that has that positivity is really good. I'm interested when you say, when you were talking about, you often write poetry, because a lot of poetry that you read is incredibly emotional. Has that always been something that you've done to sort of like express emotions or experiences or things that are happening?
Well, so the poetry started about 10 years ago only, really. I mean, I wrote some poetry when I was 20 whatever years old, and I've got some of it, and it's really not good. But the stuff that I've written in the past 7-8 years, some of it has some resonance and power, and one or two of the poems that I wrote before, we've actually grafted across into the grief opera just because they fit, or Vladimir saw that they would fit. He lifted one or two things from a little collection of poetry that I published a few years ago, time and again. He said, we could do music for this. And I'm going, what? I wrote that years ago. But so there's been some sort of creative outlet that I didn't get to in my, while I was like being a business executive and all that, right? It just wasn't the surfacing. But it's surfaced now, and it has power. By coincidence, I also took up singing about 10 years ago, just in community choirs, right? Singing. And without that, I wouldn't have been able to sing in the grief opera either, right? So it's a sort of like coming together of the poetry and the singing, and then George's death. And then Vladimir, who had also, it turned out, lost a bandmate to suicide decades ago. But he absolutely, it whole resonated for him, right? And then as I looked around and I was thinking about who would sing with us, I approached a guy who sings in a nearby choir whom I knew a little, and I didn't know, but he had lost his son. Gavin McRae had lost his son to suicide years ago, and so on and so on. So we've got this going on, and yeah, so the poetry, a journey into creativity. I think maybe that's a thing here. I wouldn't have thought of myself as creative in terms of music or poetry or whatever 10 years ago, yet it can happen. And I think we often script ourselves and go, I'm not creative. Well, who knows, right? I mean, and I think also what's happened here is when you have the sort of traumatic loss that we've experienced, that puts you in another space. You're immediately somewhere else, right? A lot of time in life, we're kind of doing the same thing. And there is routine, and you need some routine in life, right? But losing someone who you care about, especially in a way where there's shock and surprise, that changes you. So your familiar paths are gone. So you it's awful, but you're going to have to re-navigate. And you will experience yourself differently. You'll experience life differently. And that's where I think the theme that you've come up with for this session of channeling grief through creativity, I think is really cool. It's awful. None of us want to be in this situation. But if we are in this situation, if you're not going to think again about life and what it is, and maybe what a good life could be, and then, if you're not going to think about it then, when are you going to think about it, right? So you might not be able to think about it in like the first week or month or whatever, right? But there probably will come a moment where you could go, God, this is awful. I've lost this person. Life is fragile. Life is finite. Whatever we imagine or believe about what may or may not follow this life is really short, and goodness, how am I living? How am I being? What could I do? What could I create? It's life-changing, right?
I think there's also something about like removing your, like I definitely found like I needed a bit of a change in routine after Jen died, like because I just going, I had a normal job at the time, and even just like the day-to-day of just going into work and really feeling like I had nothing, like nothing mattered, and I didn't have anything to live for. And I guess even by the time later when I was like, okay, I'm going to write this thing, it was like, oh, I've actually got to feel like I've got a bit of a purpose again. Not that Jen was my purpose before, but it just gave me a bit of a light through.
That's beautiful. I think, yes, I think finding, I got completely disorientated. I mean, what the hell do you do after I've lost my son? I'd seen him twice in the preceding 2 months. I didn't see it coming. I missed it. I mean, it's completely catastrophic, irrecoverable. So my beliefs about life, life will work out. We'll come through. Everything will end okay, happily. Actually, no. No, yeah. That's not it. there's another thing. There's another thing going on. Um, Life is unpredictable. We don't know. A loss could come from anywhere. We sort of know that intellectually, right? But until we experience it, that's then another level of, oh right, okay. So then I think there can be a prompt to being more purposeful about life, more intentional, and there's some sort of silver lining, right? And then this wish for something good to come, and I think that can help us survive. Actually, really.
Mm. We need something positive though, don't we? Like human beings, it's a need. We can't just live in this perpetual cycle of negativity, which that initial period of grief is for a lot of people, right? There's this constant negativity and constant sadness and loss and grief. What is really important to be able to experience those emotions, because as a rule of thumb, emotions need to be felt to be freed, right? We need to feel emotions for them to then leave us alone. But actually, on a sort of flip side of that, we deserve a little bit of a break sometimes. And actually, as much as creativity can be used as a vehicle for grief, sometimes creativity, this is just put this out there into the conversation. Sometimes it's about getting as far away from the grief as possible and just having fun again.
Yeah.
Like I remember, I used to play the flute, right? I'm
Whoa.
terrible. I was absolutely terrible with the flute. I'm not here to say I'm this, I can play the flute. I can't. But I remember it was we we were and Sam played the trumpet quite well, not always well, but quite well
But
generally.
it's a
And
really, really loud one to go wrong, isn't it?
yeah, especially when there's a 13-year-old playing a cornet and it's just I'm trying to do my homework in the other room. I'm like, and then my other brother took up the drums as well, so it was my poor parents. So anyways, I was like, I can't remember when, it must have been quite soon after, but we sort of did found my flute, and Tom, my younger brother, like found the drums, and we just sort of just thought it was really funny to do this again, and sort of just started making some very bad music and just had a sort of laugh through this. And I guess actually, like, really central to creativity is enjoyment. And when you're in a really bad moment of your life, even though it can be quite hard to do, like finding a reason to find something fun again or to have some fun and to enjoy it. And I'm sure, Nigel, even though it was quite a serious topic and obviously incredibly meaningful, the grief opera, I'm sure there were moments in that that were really fun and like enjoyable for you to create something like that.
Yes. Yes. And so as an example, in the grief opera, there's the song "Busy Busy," which actually George and I and Tom, my other son, performed together before George, obviously, some years ago with George, and it's a light and fun song about busyness, really, and how we just get stuck in, and there's a chorus that goes, "Busy, busy, busy. Are you busy? Are you busy?" And when the crowd were when we performed it, and the crowd were joining in the chorus. Anyway, George wrote to me afterwards about how beautiful it was when the crowd joined in, and so on and so on. And we brought that in because that was George and I. So it's kind of early in the grief opera, but we're performing together. And then at the end, so somehow beyond the shock and the pain, there's a greater experience of love, right? When your heart is torn open, right? More open to everything. There's more experience of more love, more joy. We've been blessed with now 3 grandchildren since George died, and they bring so much joy in our lives. And the grief opera subtitle is "Love Goes On." Love goes on, right? There's grief and there's love, and there's just one little verse at the end of the grief opera, which is it a plot spoiler? I think it's okay. So it goes like this: "You know all this will soon be gone, and you may see your works outshone, but know your love will ripple on. The work of love is never done." So after all the grief, or the grief continues, right? So I experience now in my life continuing sort of background, as Isabelle was saying, I'm still early, right? Not even 3 years in. There's sadness running every day. There's sadness running. And joy, with our grandchildren especially, at the same time. And this feeling of expansiveness, of love radiating from the heart, so much more present, right? So there's this blended, nuanced, crazy mix of emotions, right? It's used to say, I'm so glad you've highlighted, it's not all awful. Well, in the initial days, it might be all awful. But after some time, there's a blend, right? Of beauty and pain and love and loss. And here we are.
It's an amazing it's amazing to hear you say that, actually, and you can tell you produce some good poetry, Nigel. It's the way you speak is so poetic and beautiful. But it's so true, isn't it, that it's always a blend of different things, and it's so important that we can find those different parts of it to look after ourselves when things are sad, but make sure we're finding those moments of joy. And I'm a big advocate for trying new things. I never considered myself very good at writing, for example, and so that was a bit of a leap of faith. Um, and I think we lose out on opportunities to find these coping mechanisms if we shut ourselves off to trying new things. So, sort of a question I had for both of you is, like, you both clearly have very specific um, sort of areas of creativity, as it were. But do you ever do anything outside of that specific area, that you find as like a creative outlet, or is there anything that you'd maybe consider trying, that you've sort of gone, oh, that would be interesting to like try and see what might come out of it? For me, just to give you an example, um, music, not I don't see as very accessible to me, but painting I've always found absolutely fascinating. Um, I'm not particularly good at painting, whatever that means. But Sam was an amazing painter, and a lot of his emotions came out in his painting. And I know that friends of mine that can paint just find it an amazing escape and a way of like expressing emotions. And a lot of people I work with really struggle to articulate in words how they're feeling. But if you give them a pen or paper, some paper and drawing, particularly younger people, children, they can do what we're doing with words, but on paper, and find just as much um, relief out of doing that. So I'd love to do that, and I've tried a few times. I had someone tell me once that if you try painting with your mouth, um, it can be better for
I'd
like
pay to
being
see
able to
that then.
process something without your sort of external voices going, that's bad, you're not very good at this, because you sort of go into it expecting it to be bad, so you can just sort of have fun and see what you can create with it. I'm yet to try that, I'll be honest, but it's in there. Do either of you have like something else you do, or something that you'd be interested in trying?
I'd quite like. I mean, it's in my head, in the back of my mind all the time. I've done quite a lot of singing in the past. I don't really do it anymore, but just to go back to singing lessons, because I think it's a different medium, and doing like just doing stuff that's like either kind of musical theatre, which I won't do professionally, or like jazz, because then it's also like, for me, so much of what I do has kind of like a means to an end in terms of like business, and it's like, okay, well, I'll do some script writing, or I'll do this, and but that's all in the service of my career. Whereas if I'm just doing singing for the fun of it and for the joy of it, then that I also think that singing is quite I think it really makes it's very unmasking for humans. Like, and again, this might just be British people as well, but we're not encouraged to like open our mouths and make noise. And so just to like, really not worry about like how it sounds. It's not for recording. It's not for like an audition or anything. It's just for the joy of making music. Um, And then I'm like, oh, I could do that, or I could actually make some comedy songs. There's a little bit of my head's always like, no, why don't you make some money out of that? But no, I'd like to do that just for myself.
That sounds beautiful, Isabelle. I'm confident you would bring a great voice in one way or another.
Perhaps not today.
Not today. Sure. Go into the mics.
I'm very croaky today.
Well, there's always a sort of husky voice thing. It depends what you're going to do, right, with the voice.
Some kind of French jazz, I think.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should connect you with Vladimir Miller, my collaborator, and his jazz. He's an amazing pianist. I mean, something really cool could.
I'm also trying to manage my own ambitions for myself. Of I'm pregnant with a baby and writing a new show. I'll take up a new hobby.
Oh, sure. Take up something new as well. I think it could all add up to something. I'm working on something different, and it's really, again, is coming out of my feelings about George. It's about how people can move from stuck to flow, from a feeling of stuckness to flow, right? Practical exercises for that. George talked about being stuck in work. He used that word twice. And if I knew then what I know now, I would have what? We need to talk, right? So how people can move from stuckness to, we sometimes think, can't do anything about this. I can't do with that. This is all, and all that stuff, the voices that you talked about, Ben, but there are exercises we can do, whether it's following our breath, whether it's singing a song, whether it's letting thoughts go, a stack of stuff, right? So that's one thing that I think will come out in the next few months on Instagram and YouTube and wherever. The other thing that's been bugging in my mind, and I don't know if I'm going to manage to do it or not, but I'm going to need coaching from you, Isabelle, or somebody. It's a little show called The Hazards of Saying Hello. And it's about what happens when we say hello. I'm big on saying hello to people, right? Even sometimes when they're not expecting it. And sometimes this goes very well. And sometimes it's kind of like, why is he saying hello to me? Is it just because I'm a human being or what?
Sorry, do you do that in London? Because I'm going to have to end this conversation.
It's hard in London, right? I got the coach in. I got the National Express coach in this morning. And the only person I said hello to is my daughter, whom I met, and of course the person who kindly made my coffee before I came in here, and colleagues in Suicide&Co. So
that's a lot of hello, Nigel, for a Londoner.
I didn't even say hello to the bus driver, the coach driver, properly. But yeah, you're right. In London, it's hard. But in my small town, a distance away, in our local area anyway, in our street, I'm getting very specific now, pretty much everybody knows pretty much everybody, and pretty much everybody says hello and how are you? And that's a nice thing, right? We talk about building community. Let's build community. Well, how? What you going to do, right? So yeah, I'll be careful as I leave London this afternoon, Isabelle, who I say. The hazards of saying hello. So will I manage it? I don't know. I tried stand up once and I completely bombed, really.
Everyone bombs in their first stand up, Nigel.
Oh, thanks. That's good coaching already.
Nigel, I'm 9 years in and I still bomb.
No. I'm guaranteed to bomb the second time, because if so, I'd probably better get through it sooner rather than later.
No, you just got to keep getting up. It's like a form of torture.
Torture, great. There we go. Yeah. This is a way through grief, right? Torture.
Yeah, I said at the beginning of lockdown, I was like, God, I didn't realise that my kink was going into small rooms full of people who don't find me funny and trying to make me laugh.
Do you know what you've kind of exploring here what I think is a really huge idea, and if I try to summarize it, it might go a bit like this. In life, we sort of imagine, or might imagine at some points, that life should work out and things should go well, and we should get, we should pass exams and we should get a good job and we should all these things. And of course, sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. It really doesn't. And I'd like us to somehow normalize that sometimes life is great and it flows and we get there. And often we don't. And maybe the first time we try something, whether it's stand up or playing the piano or whatever in public, we're going to bomb. And that's okay, because that's actually what happens, right? And I think one of the things that can lead us to kind of a sense of great failure is this idea, well, I should have been successful, or this should have worked, right? And life isn't like that. It's a mix. Even people who do remarkable things, well, as you both have done, and I suppose the grief opera in itself is a bit on the remarkable side. There's failure along the way. In our case, we all got this huge, well, I've got this huge sense of failure regarding George, right? So failure is part of life. It just is. Yeah. And if we can, sorry.
Yeah, no. I think that's actually a very good podcast about that, which I listen to regularly. It's called How to Fail, and I think it's really, really great for like working through your own like moments of thinking, oh, I'm not doing well enough. But I think the other thing to sort of note, if you are sort of creating work from grief, and I think, and I really found this when my show was first reviewed in 2021, and having to distance my feelings and my work from the reviewers and what their opinions are, and that's reviewers professional, and also like in stand up, like an audience is essentially reviewing you every time they don't laugh out loud at a joke. And so if you are doing something creative, like just make sure you remember that how much of that is for you and how much of that is for an audience or for the reader. And if it is 100% for you, then you don't have to let anyone read it. You don't have to give it to anyone. You don't have to allow anyone else in if it is just for you. If you want people to read it, you can say, I mean, I still have to, obviously not necessarily stuff about grief, but I have to say to people after a gig, like, I'm not taking notes. Like, this is not, I appreciate that you've got some feedback for me. Maybe we can have it tomorrow if it's someone that I trust. But in the immediacy after a gig, I'm quite vulnerable. And I'm already turning over in my head the things that have gone wrong, the things I didn't say right, the lines I missed out, and I think it's just about remembering that your creativity, it will always, if you put it in anywhere public or anywhere out of yourself, it will be reviewed, but you don't have to take any of that on. You can literally just stick a wall up and go, I'm not taking, this is an expression of how I've been feeling, and I don't want someone to review it.
Beautiful.
This brings me on to a question I had actually, because whilst we can talk about the sort of positivities and positives of creativity and grief, actually there can be negativities, right? The idea of criticism being one, and the fear of failure, but also, it can be particularly for us and us three who have this creative outlet is actually sort of, it's not really an outlet anymore, it's sort of the creative standard. It's sort of made up a large part of our life. It can potentially have a bit of a negative effect. It can delay grief. It can make things more difficult. It can bring up feelings when you don't necessarily want to be feeling that. How if I go to Nigel, how can you think of any reasons why creativity might have been a difficult thing for you to do at that moment? Did it delay your grief at all? Did it change how you grieved in a negative way at all?
It's a great question. I think it did change my relationship to grief in a big way. I think it didn't make it easier in the short term. I mean, I was really facing it. I was writing to George, writing about George, writing about my experience of grief, writing about my regrets, asking for him to come back, negotiating all of that, and seriously, and talking with George in my imagination or in reality, and writing that as well. So it was awful. But I think it would have been awful if I hadn't have done it as well. So, and I think maybe sometimes, definitely sometimes, it's, if you kind of go like, you've just lost somebody and I kind of go, well, try being creative. I mean, that's probably not the thing, right? It's really not the thing. You're feeling down, be creative. It's really not, right? You just got to just be with people, right? But that's another whole subject. So I didn't write in order to feel better, and I don't think it made it any better in the short term. But as a healing process, I think it's been transformational. I mean, stupendously transformational. I asked somebody to come along, and she said she might come along, but her partner couldn't come along. He had lost somebody a decade ago and never talked about it. So he wouldn't be able, it would be huge for him to come along to Grief Opera because he's like bottled it up for 10 years. And if he did come along, which he hasn't so far as I know, it would be really emotional, would be really difficult. And it may or may not be.
That happens quite a lot, Nigel. Someone will bring their friend who's just never spoken about their brother who's died by suicide. And then they're just exposed to all of your feelings and then also confronted with all of their own. And I think that's actually, if you're doing any kind of performance work, I think that is arguably the most difficult thing, I think, is how it confronts other people's, and then the fact that you have to, in a way, you have to manage that.
Yeah. Well, and sorry.
I guess even the fact that you know that her partner can't come because he has not dealt with those feelings is almost, and it's no criticism on this woman, but it's just that she's given you this information that then you have to manage a little bit when you actually that should be, we all deal with things in our own ways, but that is something immensely personal. And if my partner hadn't dealt with some emotions that have from stuff that had happened 10 years ago, I would sort of be encouraging them into therapy.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think encouraging is quite a weak word for me. I'd be shoving them into therapy.
Yeah. Well, so sometimes it's too hard, right? Just to
absolutely
to approach. So I'm not. Yeah, but what we can say is, if we've probably all heard this phrase, "Time is a healer." You kind of go, well, I don't know. Kind of depends what you do in the time, right?
Yeah.
If you don't do anything about it with it, maybe it's just too hard. You don't know how. So there it is, right? Maybe
I think there are a lot of families like that as well in this country. I mean, in this country, in lots of places. I think there are a lot of people who cannot acknowledge. I think I've come across 5 people who've said that they know that their friend or their partner's someone in that family died, and they don't even acknowledge that it's suicide. And so, and I wondered, like, what those conversations around the dinner table must look like. On big holidays, they must acknowledge them, but then does anyone ever kind of break rank and go like, are we going to talk about this?
Really hard.
Anyway.
Really,
it is
really tough stuff. But
I think a lot of people. Sorry, Nigel.
No, I was just going to say, hopefully, at some point, people who haven't will listen to a podcast like this or whatever it is, or some experience, or get along to a show and maybe find a way to face this a little bit more, to work with it a little bit, right? Maybe. We hope so.
I was just going to say, I mean, we're sort of moving towards wrapping up now, but on this point, I know this podcast is about, people that are dealing with their own suicide loss, but actually a part of creativity, particularly around suicide loss, just enables us to start really digging away at the foundations of why people don't want to admit that certain deaths were suicide. And actually, creativity can be such an amazing way of really just stripping away at that stigma in a way that stats and data and uncreative ways of trying to do this just won't ever do. Creating shows about suicide, creating operas about suicide, creating books and writing about suicide, creating, whatever it is, charity runs, whether it's whatever you choose to do that's creating something good that just goes, this is happening and this we're doing this because of this awful thing that's happened. That the ripple effect that causes is immense, because we're then showing everyone else that actually it is okay to talk about, and it's not only is it okay to talk about, it's okay to you know talk about my own feelings and the ups and downs of it, and it's a beautiful thing. And in those families where, because I'm sure there'll be people listening to this that are existing in one of those situations where they want to talk about what's going on, and they're feeling that awkwardness coming back from other people, actually by doing something like a charity event, raising money for charity, doing a run, painting something, it can be in private, creating an opera or a show or a play or whatever it is, or a book. It's an amazing way of you being able to tell that story. Whether it's shown to other people or not, that's a separate question. But it's a way for you to be able to have that say on what it is, and find that outlet for your grief, because everyone needs an outlet of some sort, and that can be amazing. So I guess to wrap up then, how do you wrap up that? We all need to get more creative. I need to get an apron on, get some paints out. I need to go and find my flute and go for some singing lessons. Nigel, you'd said you're going to do your second stand up. Um, anything else that we're committing to now?
Well, the group that does the grief opera, committed to performing the grief opera on Suicide Prevention Day, Tuesday the 10th of September, in Bath at Birdall's Yard in the evening, and tickets are on Eventbrite, and some tickets are still available, so rush down on the Paddington train or wherever you are to get to Bath, and it may be the most emotional show you see this year. Our commitment is to be there. Yeah.
It's a good point, actually, and you'll be able to find all of that information, I'm sure, in the podcast description and on Suicide&Co's socials. Maybe to wrap up then, if we finish with some advice for people listening that maybe think creativity isn't for me, never got involved in anything creative, don't see themselves as a particularly creative person, what could they do to sort of embrace that creativity, and what's that first step towards understanding how creativity can be used as a vehicle or to help their grief?
I think if you don't think you're creative, or you don't think you're good at this, or it's not part of your skill set, I think you should still just do it. I think most people are quite creative, and it's just that they've our school system has formed you into a different path, or and also it doesn't, in a way, if it's just for you, it doesn't matter whether you're creative. It doesn't matter if it's good writing. It doesn't matter if it's good singing or if it's good painting. If it's just a way of you getting out of your head, I think it's really important to just do that, no matter what.
I completely agree, Isabelle, and to be aware that there may be a thought in your head that says you're not creative. It's just a thought, right? We're creating each moment. We can create a gag, maybe. Well, you can anyway, and you can have a thought and allow yourself the idea that maybe you could be wildly creative and you just haven't discovered that yet. And then I thought your advice earlier about being cautious who you show stuff to, because people like shooting people down, right? You write a poem.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it's not that good first time around, right? First time you try and write a poem, probably not going to be that good. Fine. Like first time in comedy, you told us, Isabelle, you're going to bomb. That's it. You have to get past that and go, it's actually not going to be that good for a while.
Yeah.
Probably, but if I work at it, sooner or later, I'm going to get better, is a brilliant mindset to have.
I think what I've learned from stand-up is and it's something that you learn quite quickly. So just FYI, I trained as an actor and I didn't think I could write. I was like, oh no, that's not really my thing. And now that forms 50% of my career, if not more. Stand-up teaches you failure. If a joke doesn't work, it might not work ever, but it might just take some honing, but you cannot with stand-up, you can't know if a joke works until you've tested it in front of an audience. And so I think everyone should try it, actually, but there's a bravery to standing up and trying that in front of an audience and knowing that the potential for failure is 90%. And so it's a question of, when I say put pen to paper, I mean that like you cannot fail until you've put that pen to paper. You can't say you're not creative until you've tried it. And no one else can say you're not creative if they haven't read your work. So just write it and keep it to yourself.
Perfect.
That's it, exactly. And there's lots of other things that people can do, right? That, yes, there's fundraising. I guess we sort of narrow creativity in our mind to art, when actually, like Nigel said, we're creating every moment. You can find different things to create. You can fundraise, you can do a charity fundraiser, you can take on a hobby that the person you've lost loved, like a hobby they did. That can be quite a nice way of sort of feeling like close to them again after you've lost them. But lots of things that we can do. That was really inspiring. Thank you both. I love these podcasts. It's so nice to sit here and chat to people that are just so inspiring. Nigel, thank you so much for your time. What you've created after losing George is just absolutely remarkable, and I'm hoping that as many people as possible can come in September on World Suicide Prevention Day to witness what you've created in person. It would be fantastic for as many people to be there as possible. It's just extraordinary, and thank you so much for coming on and chatting to us both.
Pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you both.
Thanks so much for listening. Conversations and Company would like to thank Acast, our wonderful guests, and all of you listeners. Thank you for your generous support. Please rate, review, and subscribe, or send a link to someone who might need it. Remember, you can go to our website to check out the various support services available through Suicide&Co. We'll be back with another episode soon.